This video lecture is going to cover the topics of pregnancy and infancy as we begin, talking about child development. There's lots to cover in this video lecture, and there's going to be a documentary that accompanies this video lecture, but we'll get to that in a minute. But before we start, I thought I would introduce myself again. My name is Rose Sullivan. This is what I look like, so if you want to see me around campus and say hello, just remind me that maybe I know you from the online world and not the in-person world, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what I look like so you might recognize me walking around campus. I also have a very important assistant. This is my very important assistant. Her name is Dovey, otherwise known as Lovey Dovey. Dovey is a puppy. She's 5 months old at this point, and she's pretty insane, and I'm going to blame any ruckus that might happen in the background on my assistant, who doesn't really understand the concept of being quiet while recording, but she is at least cute. She's got that going for her. So blame Dovey if there's some strange sounds in the background. But getting to the topic of pregnancy and infancy, this is just the beginning of a lifespan, obviously, and there are just so many different factors that are at play when you think about having a child and then beginning the process of raising that child. And so this slide really starts to talk about some of those external social influences that start with a pregnancy and continue on the entire lifetime of a child, essentially. So these are all of the things that have enormous consequence to children. Everything from the size and the shape and the location of your living space, to whether or not you have multiple caretakers, whether or not you have siblings, whether or not you have multiple generations, either living in your home or living close to you. And there are a lot of customs once a child is born that shapes their experience. For example, sleeping patterns, one of them. In the United States, there is a movement very, very much supported by pediatricians that say that infants, should sleep alone on their backs in a crib, and that since we are a culture that values independence, that is an extremely important thing to be doing right away with your child. But as we probably well know, throughout the world, sleeping patterns are very, very different. Co-sleeping, family beds, other kinds of arrangements. So actually, that's a good point that leads to the second point underneath that category about how we view dependence and independence as we raise children, and what kinds of rites of passage. How do families and parents handle work patterns or work responsibilities at the same time that they try to raise children? How are children held in different cultures? Are they put in slings or in or on baby boards or held in one's arms or carriers? I mean, actually, the business of how you carry your child is a very important cultural experience in the raising of a child. And the last category refers to the psychology of the caretakers, and this is a really big influence on how children are raised. How healthy, psychologically speaking, are their parents, or what kinds of issues are their parents struggling with that might get passed down to the next generation. These are all really important points in thinking about conceptualizing the process of raising a child. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that a lot of people might know the nuts and bolts of how babies are actually made, but it is helpful when you're talking about the beginning of infancy to also talk about pregnancy and what happens in pregnancy. When someone gets pregnant, the expectation is that they will be pregnant for 40 weeks. And the gestational age and the fertilization age are two different ages that obstetricians or midwives will calculate based on someone's last menstrual period or 14 days after that menstrual period. It gets kind of complicated, but the large picture is 9 months or 40 weeks of gestation. So somebody, if you're doing quick math in your head, you might say, well, 9 months is 36 weeks. How do we get that extra 4 weeks? And you go back to this gestational age, fertilization age debate, and that's how those 2 weeks essentially gets added, and it can be complicated though. But ultimately, a full-term pregnancy is 9 months. Another way to look at it is somewhere between 266 and 280 days. And probably, as people well know, the gestation period is organized by trimesters of 3 months each. So once a sperm and egg meet, they create a zygote, kind of a free-floating combined cell. And then at some point, that zygote implants itself into the uterine wall, and at that point, it's known as an embryo. And this happens pretty quickly upon fertilization. And the implantation into the uterine wall is actually a very important milestone for a number of reasons, but especially relating to this second point here around teratogens, which are substances that are passed through the embryo, to the embryo rather, from the mother that may cause harm to the developing embryo. And so I think when you hear about substances that can cause harm in a pregnancy, people go right away to really known toxicity like smoking, like alcohol, or illegal drugs, or things like that. But there are tons of substances that actually can be quite harmful to a developing pregnancy that we all use every day. So things like caffeine, things like Advil, things like most over-the-counter medications for most things, most prescriptions, frankly, for most things. These are all in this category of substances that can be damaging to a developing pregnancy. And what's key about that is that these things can start to damage a developing pregnancy beginning in the 3rd week. And for many, many people, they don't even know they're pregnant yet at that point. So they're just going along, living their normal life, and they could be taking their prescriptions, taking their over-the-counter medication, having multiple cups of coffee in a day, all of this stuff, without realizing actually that they could be harming their pregnancy. And so the idea of teratogens is kind of an important piece of information, so that as social workers who might be working with pregnant clients, we can provide some education around that, because it's very likely that people don't know. And even if they know they're pregnant, they might not know about some of the items that can be really potentially harmful. And so here in this next chart, you can see some examples of some of these toxic substances for pregnancy, and you can see what the effects are on fetal development. And so you'll notice that there are some some obvious things like LSD, probably not a good idea to be taking during your pregnancy, but there are also some other things like most SSRIs. There was a big debate that I think has been kind of finally settled, that taking antidepressants or SSRIs during the pregnancy leads to higher rates of autism in children when they're born. And this has been the source of a lot of controversy, because there's another group of people that are saying some people really need to be on these medications, that you can't ask someone to not be on them. And there was some challenge to the science around whether or not that actually increases rates of autism in children. I think, and this can certainly be something that gets discussed more in class, but I think that the science has come down pretty definitively now on the increased rates of autism among babies whose parent takes antidepressants during pregnancy. So, and there are a lot of medications, psychotropic medications, that are actually harmful to a pregnancy. So those are some examples of things that people might be doing that they don't realize that they're doing, or they don't know could be potentially harmful to the developing fetus. So around the 8th week after fertilization, you have a strong implantation, hopefully, to the uterine wall. And at this point, after the 8th week, you officially have a fetus. A woman who has had previous pregnancies, we would call that person by the medical term multigravadia. No one in social work probably uses that. 7 to 12, you can have a really strong fetal heart rate that you can hear. There's also during that week, that early time in the pregnancy, expectations of heart rate. And unfortunately for some people, if the fetus has a lower heart rate than what they expect for the gestational age, they might end up being at risk for a miscarriage, or also called a spontaneous abortion. And that is obviously most common in the first trimester. And for some people, frankly, it's a relief to miscarry. For some people, it's completely devastating. So that is something, if you're working with pregnant clients, that would be interesting to explore with someone who is experiencing that. It might not be what you anticipate they're experiencing. But again, it can be helpful information for working with pregnant clients to help them understand what's going on, even biomedically, during this period of time. During the second trimester, this is generally a time where a pregnant client might feel pretty good about themselves and the world, generally because during the second trimester, a lot of the discomforts and unpleasantry of the first trimester are hopefully over. So generally, you might have people who are no longer hopefully having morning sickness. That incredibly intense exhaustion that a lot of people feel in the first trimester hopefully has passed, and you might feel like your energy is back. So anxiety might be lifted for some clients because they're past the first trimester, meaning that the rate of miscarriage goes down. So a lot of people experience the second trimester as kind of the best part of pregnancy. And that's also the period of time where someone might feel the movement of their baby clearly for the first time. And for somebody who is wanting their pregnancy and somebody who is excited about their pregnancy, that is a really major milestone and something that they are often very excited about. And so in the third trimester, obviously this is the last 3 months before birth, and this is when things like excessive weight gain and gestational diabetes and the possibility for early delivery, preterm delivery, things that might increase the risk for a C-section go up. This is the third trimester, is when the developing fetus is putting on a lot of its own weight. So a lot of times you see someone in pregnancy go from being a certain size to being quite large in their pregnancy. It reflects the weight gain of the baby. And the weight gain and the organ development are really critical in the last trimester, really preparing that baby to be born. And so that's where things like smoking and low birth weight come into effect for a pregnant person and their baby. One of the things that is the last part of the baby to develop is the lungs. And so anything that might interfere with lung development can be very dangerous to a third trimester baby, a third trimester fetus. And so smoking and low birth weight are real risks for that because the baby doesn't develop the way it should. And so you can see here just some consequences of a premature or low birth weight baby, and things like respiratory distress, and things like sudden infant death syndrome, or a greater chance of dying than a full-term infant. If you've ever, and you probably even could do this even on your own time, but if you Googled a picture of a 32-week delivered baby versus a 40-week full-term baby and just look at the size difference and look at the overall physical health difference, it's quite shocking. So that third trimester is very important for the baby to develop internally and in terms of weight, so that when the baby is born, it has a greater shot of being healthy. And so here again, you can see some of the consequences of prematurity and low birth weight babies. You might be surprised to see that a low birth weight baby is a baby that's under 5.5 pounds, but for such a tiny person, the difference between 5.5 pounds and 6 pounds is actually quite a large difference. And these are very, very small babies, and they have a lot of special needs. And you can see this very frightening statistic about low birth weight babies being 100 times, the really, really teeny ones, the ones that are oftentimes in the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU. They have 100 times greater risk of death than a full-term baby. And that's just huge. So the size and the physical maturity of a third trimester fetus becoming a baby is really critical to overall health, and in terms of the stress of the caregivers. Having a baby is always a very stressful experience, but if you have a baby with these special needs around prematurity or low birth weight, an already overwhelming experience is even more overwhelming for new parents and the caregivers of those babies. They're very, very fragile babies, and they need a lot of stuff and they need a lot of attention. And oftentimes, someone who has given birth to a low birth weight or premature baby might be having their own health problems that might have been part of why the baby came early or why the baby wasn't born big enough. And so now you have an overwhelming experience on top of at least one of the caregivers maybe being ill themselves. And that is all a very, very overwhelming way to start your time in the world. So, more commentary here about the premature and low birth weight babies. Babies are often weighed in grams, not especially the very little ones. And so you can see that 1,000 grams is 2.2 pounds. And a baby that is 2.2 pounds really most of the time will fit in the palm of your hand. And again, if you want to see some pretty surprising photos of how small 2.2 pounds is, you can again kind of Google that and get an image. But you are really looking at a very, very tiny baby compared to a full-term baby. So we've mentioned a moment ago about some of the risks for newborns in general, particularly newborns who are born early or low birth weight: cerebral palsy, blindness, deafness, cognitive delays, feeding intolerances. And so all of these things are obviously major physical challenges for any child, but they also create another level of stress onto the caregivers for caring for a child like that, and the resources that are needed, both in terms of money, but also in terms of time and support in now being the parent of a child who needs extra care on top of the already overwhelming care that often a baby requires. So hopefully, when a full-term baby is born, they are between 5 and 10 pounds. And even at that healthy weight, obviously, as an infant, they are totally and utterly dependent on those around them to meet their basic needs. So one of the things that can be expected in terms of physical milestones is that a baby that's born at 5 to 10 pounds will triple their weight. And this calls into focus the importance of nutrition, for everybody. But when you're looking at an infant who has so much development happening in a relatively short period of time, nutrition is enormous, which of course then brings into the debate about formula feeding versus breastfeeding. And so nutrition affects physical stature, motor skill development, brain development, and really every single other aspect of development, which is then what ignites that debate about what is best. When a baby is first born, they are just trying to survive in the world. And so what does self-regulation look like for a typical infant? It looks like, can it control its temperature? Can it stop itself from getting too hot or too cold? And so generally speaking, babies are swaddled and wrapped most of the time because they don't have that ability yet to warm themselves up if they get too cold. You start to see the early signs of regulation around sleeping and eating and toileting or diapering. There are cultural variations and controversies about how caregivers shape that, especially around sleeping and eating. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this is the only thing you can really expect of an infant, that they are trying in those first early weeks of life to just keep their body temperature somewhat stable, and they're trying to sleep, and they're trying to eat, and they're trying to not experience gas and constipation, essentially. So that's really their big job when they're first born. The other thing that's happening is just massive explosion of neurological development, particularly around the areas of sensory development, sensory abilities. So I won't delve too deeply into this slide because you're going to see this with real babies in the documentary that's part of this video lecture. But they are learning to experience their environment through their senses. through all of their various ways of engaging the world: hearing, taste, touch, smell, sensitivity to pain. One of the first things that happens when a baby is born and continues throughout those first early months of life is something called skin-to-skin contact. And so that is when the baby is either wearing nothing or maybe wearing a diaper and is cuddling with and wrapped up with one of their caregivers who is also not wearing anything, so that you're having that skin-to-skin contact between the infant and the parent. And back to that earlier slide about self-regulation, there's been some really fascinating research at the success of babies being able to do all of that regulatory work in the context of skin-to-skin contact. It's really now considered one of the most important experiences of very early infancy, newborns, to give them that skin-to-skin contact with their caregivers. And that's a powerful sensory experience for them. And since the sensory system is really all that they have right now, then that's how they get it, through that experience of cuddling and swaddling and skin to skin and feeding and all of those things that their caregivers do for them. And now the other thing to realize about babies is that they are kind of a big bundle of reflexes in those very, very early days. And the various reflexes that babies have will disappear over time and will disappear over development. And the emergence and the disappearing of these reflexes is actually a lot of really good information when you're working with very young infants and their families. So in the very early few months of their life, you're looking for these reflexes, and then you're looking for these reflexes to disappear later in development, maybe a few months later. And these reflexes are really purely neurological. There's really nothing conscious going on with a baby around these reflexes. And so some people may have heard about the rooting reflex, and that is where you can stimulate the sucking reflex. Essentially, that's how they know that something might be nearby that they can latch onto, and so you can see that very clearly if with a very young infant, if you kind of tickle their cheek or their side of their mouth. You can also see that the rooting when a child who is typically breastfed is on their caregiver and nuzzling them and kind of pushing their face into their chest. I mean, that's rooting. They're looking for something to latch onto. And so that obviously leads to the sucking reflex, where and this is obviously something that's pretty easily seen in most infants. They're gonna put anything in their mouth and suck on it. And that is obviously critical for feeding, both breastfeeding and bottle feeding. You have to have the ability to suck. And so one of the things that might occur with a very young infant, a newborn, that interferes with the sucking reflex is something called a tongue tie. And that is where that very thin membrane of skin in the middle of your tongue that kind of attaches your tongue to your mouth is too large or too thick, and it prevents the baby's tongue to get into the right position for feeding and sucking. And so some people, some kids can deal with that if it's minor and it's not a big deal, but for some kids there's a very minor surgical procedure that pediatricians will often recommend to allow them to be better suckers, because obviously the nutrition and the weight gain is really critical at this point in time. For kids who have tongue ties that don't get addressed, that perhaps needed to be addressed, obviously that's going to affect sucking, and it could also affect later on speech and language development. So the issue of what to do about a child with a tongue tie is oftentimes comes up very early in infancy. And so here in this next slide, you see the reflex, the description of the reflex, and when you might look for that to occur. So I won't obviously describe them all. You're also going to see a lot of these things in the documentary. But one of the things that to bear in mind is that these windows of time are semi-flexible. You know, if somebody isn't showing consistently sucking behavior until 3 months as opposed to 2 months, that is not particularly unusual. But you get into considerations of developmental delays if you see a significant time difference between when you would expect to see some of these reflexes and when they actually happen. So again, in typical infant development, it's very hard for them to really have a lot of control over their movements. That happens later, and it's really interesting, actually, if you've spent any time with infants, to see that develop over time. You know, when they're very, very young, newborn infants, they are scaring themselves with the flailing of their own hands, versus 6 months later, where they're actually picking things up and making deliberate movements to manipulate things. So again, you can see what you really are looking for, I suppose, is progress, steady progress over time. And sometimes the difference in an ability to have motor development happens with very young babies, even within a week or two. So you're just kind of looking for steady developmental progress in things like moving their hands and legs, turning their head, grasping at something. And here are the typical developmental milestones of infants, and again, when you would hope to see these milestones occurring. Sitting upright without somebody having to hold them. To be able to do that really requires you to be able to hold your head on your own, to be able to sit without support. And that may seem silly and obvious, but for babies, that's actually a really, really big deal. Being able to stand, being able to crawl. Before babies can crawl, one of the things that they have to be able to do is they have to be able to turn themselves over from a lying down position back to front or front to back, because you have to have that movement down before you can get to crawling. And typically, if children walk before they crawl, which sometimes happens, then what you might end up with is kids with some sensory problems or some coordination problems, because all of these milestones are kind of built on each other. So the other thing I think you see when you look at this window of milestone achievement column is that now the period of time where it is normal for this to be developing or not developing is a little wider. So if you have a parent where the child is 4 months and not sitting upright yet, that's okay. And a lot of times parents can be very anxious about developmental delays, and they can be very anxious about why aren't things happening when they're supposed to be happening. And that's a very real concern for really all parents. And it's helpful for social workers and other professionals that might work with families with young children to have some understanding of when things happen, really, so that they can provide information and reassurance, or they can provide information and then possible referrals for kids who are starting to be delayed in any of these areas. So a few slides ago, I mentioned that one of the major physical experiences of infancy is this exploding brain development. And the technical term for that would be, let me see if I can say it without messing it up, synaptogenesis, the creation of synapses. And this begins at the end of the pregnancy and continues obviously into infancy. And the term brain plasticity is something you might have heard before, but that's a huge concept in children, especially in infants, because what you're seeing is this explosive brain growth and brain changes. And every time an infant has a new experience, there's a brain change that goes with it. There are all kinds of brain changes that go with loving, affectionate, supportive, caring behaviors. And there are some very significant brain changes that happen with neglectful or abusive experiences. And in social work, we really need to understand that. And so I think as the class goes on, we're going to be talking about brain development at lots of different points in development. And a really very important subtopic is the way that psychological or social traumas affect that brain development in a negative way. But the other side is to say that loving and caring and supportive experiences shape the brain as well. And I think an important message around brain plasticity is that things can change. Things can always change. And so you can have Say, for example, a child coming out of a very, very difficult environment where there's been a lot of abuse and neglect. They've had a lot of brain changes that reflect those experiences. If they're put and then have stability in loving and nurturing environments, the brain changes again. And so brain plasticity is actually a very hopeful concept. The idea that our brains are always changing, and particularly children and infants, and that even if something starts out difficult or traumatic, improvements can be made and gains can be seen. So again, we get into cognitive development now that goes with the explosive brain development. And perhaps in other classes in undergraduate school, you might have heard about a theory that's referred to as cognitive development, and one of the major theorists there is Piaget. And Piaget's theory of cognitive development for infants, he refers to that as the sensory motor stage. And you can see the substages put here. And I'm going to embed actually a short clip of young children where these substages are pretty clearly shown. So I'm going to stop talking here for a minute and embed this clip so that people can see that, and maybe the substages that are here in this video make a little bit more sense.
Jean Piaget proposed a comprehensive theory of child cognitive development, identifying 4 major periods or stages of cognitive development. The first of these stages, the sensory motor stage, spans the age range from birth to 2 years. During the sensory motor stage, infants learn to coordinate sensory information and motor activity, becoming increasingly able to act purposefully on their environments and solve problems.
At the beginning of the sensory motor period, an infant's actions are confined to innate reflexes like sucking and grasping. Soon, however, infants will begin to show what Piaget called primary circular reactions. 1-week-old Aiden moves his hand near his mouth by chance. In the next few weeks, he will begin to try to reproduce this pleasurable experience, eventually sucking his thumb or hand purposefully. Jessipina, who is 2 months old, has learned that it is interesting to open and close her own hands near her face.
While primary circular reactions center on a child's own body, secondary circular reactions involve making interesting things happen in the world outside one's body.
While she's sitting here like this, one of the things that
By chance, 6-week-old Iceland causes the toy on the side of her bouncy seat to move, but quickly figures out how to keep it going. And 5-month-old James, again by chance, pushes a button on his toy and causes music to play. After several attempts, he is able to make the music start again at his own discretion.
Unlike primary circular reactions, secondary circular reactions are not based on reflexes, but represent the first acquired adaptations of new behaviors. At about 8 months of age, children show the first signs of planned, intentional behavior. 9-month-old Hayden, for example, drops one toy to grasp another.
Can you get big kisses? Can you? Oh, you want to eat the box. You want to eat the box. No, back to the number.
He also figures out how to move an obstacle, the exerciser, to pick up a desired toy. Before this, secondary reactions were executed for their own sake. Now, Hayden has learned that one secondary circular reaction can be used in the service of another. Hayden now uses two previously acquired schemes in coordination to achieve a goal, dropping one toy to grasp another, and moving an obstacle to retrieve a toy.
Tertiary circular reactions occur between 12 and 18 months of age. At this stage, infants begin to actively experiment with the world, to do things just to see what will happen. Tess, for example, tries a number of locations for the teething ring, ending up wearing it as a bracelet. The development of object permanence is one of the more notable cognitive changes occurring during the sensory motor period. Children younger than about 4 months of age are unaware that objects continue to exist when they are no longer visible. 2-month-old Jessipina does not even look for the toy when it is hidden.
Between 4 and 8 months, however, infants begin to retrieve objects that are partially hidden behind a barrier, as 6-month-old Anthony demonstrates. By 8 to 12 months, infants begin to show clearer signs of object concepts, consistently looking for objects when they are hidden.
Under her hat.
Tess, a 20-month-old, reaches right around a barrier to get to a toy, showing that she has achieved object permanence.
Oh.
Being able to represent objects mentally is an important cognitive change, as it allows children to think about things they can't see or touch, using insight and mental experimentation for solving problems, instead of trial and error.